Martin. Just to say, look, it's nice to be here at UL. I was saying to Martin that I've never been to the campus before, so it's a real pleasure just to have a look around and just to see what's here. The presentation that I'm going to talk to is really focused on some ideas, but hopefully it's focused on real present-day situations here in the area of community development and regeneration. So I hope in that you'll take it in that spirit, and I hope that it'll actually maybe stimulate some ideas. Or certainly I'd like to try and finish this 30 slides. I'll try and finish as quickly as I can without going too fast, but to give some time maybe for a bit of discussion, maybe a bit of questioning, maybe just comments, whatever. So that's the plan. If I suppose it's probably best if something comes up that you really feel you need to ask me a question on, that's okay, but probably best if we leave space at the end for questions, comments, and do it in that way, if that's okay, yeah? So I'm just going to give you a kind of a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about. In the first section, I'm going to put forward an argument that family support in the community development sector has become an outreach of the state welfare system. I suppose a kind of shadow welfare system, if you like. In the second section, I'm going to look at how our understanding of the state is important in terms of understanding how we can actually transform maybe our society, what the possibilities are, what the difficulties are, and what kind of things might work. And the third section looks at how family support, community development can be part of a new standardised and co-produced public service. Now this is, as I say, hopefully on the level of maybe just engaging people in a little bit of thought about what's here, what could be, and where we could get to. So that's the overview. So starting with really just looking at the present system, and my argument here is that the present arrangements for community development and family support to some degree have basically led us to a point where maybe things are not progressing, where we're not making progress in terms of those two areas, those two activities really contributing towards a better society. I suppose we're looking at, in community development, we often look at a kind of utopian view of where we want to go, which is a perfect society which embodies maybe all the morals that most of us probably cling to, morals like equality, fairness, rights. So I'm just aware that this is ground that has been gone over before, but I'm referring here to a chapter in the book by Deirdre O'Byrne, and Deirdre basically looks at some of the fault lines of community development over the last 10, 15 years. What she's really identified is that community development has become if you like, a kind of partner of the state or an arm of the state in terms of it has been co-opted, de-radicalised, and there's been a huge emphasis in community development and family support on service provision rather than developing communities, rather than more activist measures or more creation of social capital. The emphasis has been on childcare services, primarily a lot of family support work, a lot of community development work has revolved around those kind of services, maybe employment training services. And with that, there has been a rise in managerialism, standardisation, and an audit culture has prevailed. Now, managerialism is very much part of the new public services kind of management philosophy that has permeated a lot of the public services in UK first and now in this country. So what we have is this notion of people having to manage on behalf of the state. Services become standardised across different parts of the country. The expectation of the civil servants is that kind of box ticking, and that there's a huge emphasis on justifying the money that the state is giving to you. That audit becomes a kind of an activity in itself, which means there's a huge amount of paperwork going on, a huge amount of effort going into writing up reports, writing up budgetary activities, all that kind of stuff. And that has taken a toll on the activist notions of community development, the idea that we would try and create a better society, if you like, becomes very dependent, very contingent upon the funding that's available and the degree to which that can be audited. Over the past 10 years, this is basically identified as a shift away from creating community feeling through the forging of associational ties, and has instead become a system for managing disadvantage. Basically, this service culture, undermines the role of the citizen. It basically creates a situation where people don't have, the rights that might be associated with connecting with other people through associations, through civic society, and people are really seen as having to maybe fulfill some qualification, cross some threshold, or maybe some almost like a means test. You have to fall into a certain category. You become categorized rather than having a right as a citizen. You have to be in a certain category to get a service. So those are the kind of things that have, I think, impacted negatively. They've been identified by other people, so this is not new thinking, but I'm just trying to perhaps bring these together to make a point about where there is a possibility maybe of moving away from this slowly going downhill, this sort of gradient downhill, which has been put in place for community development and family support. So basically, I'm sure you're all aware of the local community local development program, which was introduced in January 2010. It replaced, if you like, a sort of organic development of community development organisations, which have taken place somewhat organic over the previous 15 years, and it's more of a standardised approach which has been taken by the government, and a systemised approach. So the programme is administered by POBL, which is working on behalf of the government, and it's delivered at a local level by 52 local development companies, and a small number of other local development groups. So it's become part of the governance structures of the state, and it's become much more integrated within that structure. And again, this is what I was saying a little bit earlier. What happens is that the campaigning, the advocacy side, which can be a thorn in the side to the government, that simply, if you like, is just taken out of the community development arena, simply because the funding, the whole structure of this new way of delivering community development means that there is a much tighter rein on people who could be problematic for the government, who might be agitators, who might challenge social order, who might have ideas about ways society should be facing. And the hallmarks of this kind of systemization are control, and basically, we end up with, again, losing the identity of people as citizens, but becoming more consumers of services, and we see that with the kind of service culture that is being created. So that's the first bit of the presentation. And really, I suppose there are some questions that we have to begin to put and maybe see if we can find some answers. And this is a quote from, I put all the sources on the last slide, so you'll see who this is really at the end. Can the government really be a benign force, an agent motivated solely by the desire to keep the social whole in health, or to restore it to such if it falls unwell? So there are, there's a big question here really about the state and what it's trying to do and where it's trying to go. And I think that goes to the heart of some of this because some of the things we look at are about really where the state is and what our understanding of it is and what it can and can't do. So we just keep that question in mind there. We might come back to it in a minute. Now, I'm not doing real justice to Mr. Hobbes or Mr. Weber. I'm really just doing a bit of a kind of steal of their overarching ideas here to make a point. And there are, I suppose, if you kind of really, look into both of Hobbes's political philosophy and Weber's sociology, you can extract, and it is a kind of how can I put it? This is a very simplistic extraction. They're both under, they both written about their views in much more depth, much more complexity than I'm really referring to here. But I'm just taking a kind of shorthand view of some of their work. And there are two orthodoxies underpinning our understanding of the state. There are two kind of starting points from which we might look at the state. The first owes a great deal to a tradition that began with Thomas Hobbes. And the Hobbesian view of society was that it was every person for themselves or every man for themselves. That we were all engaged in a struggle, and that struggle was each person against each person essentially, and that the state was a recognition that we needed a referee, we needed a night watchman, we needed somebody to keep an eye on us and stop us from doing damage to each other. Weber's thinking was that as societies become more complex, as we go through the Industrial Revolution, that there is a need for an approach to order, which the state needs to create a system. And of course, Weber's ideas were expressed through his thinking around things like bureaucracy, around the rational approach of states to creating order. So, but I think Weber's and Hobbes's views, if you like, the common thread, which as I say, I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but there is a common thread, is that the state takes a position where it has to standardise and be a little bit coercive. It has to, make the rules and stop people misbehaving and decide what's acceptable and what isn't, and what kind of things can go on and what kind of things can't. And the other tradition, again, I'm simplifying it greatly, is a tradition grounded in the philosophy of Hegel, and it's expressed through the works of Durkheim and the webs, in terms of the Fabian webs, that is. The state is the expression of a set of organic interactions between the different social actors which together make up the social body. Now, this view is more benign in the sense that it really sees the state as the kind of sum total of everything, rather than the state being an independent body that looks after the rest of us, a kind of like a super nanny or a childminder would Their view here is really that the state is everything, and that the state is part of what's going on, is part of our reality. In that sense, sorry, it's not a body that's differentiated from people's day-to-day lives. And this view obviously has a different feel to it, a very different feel to it. Now, if we, those two models, basically they can be criticised very simply again in the sense that the first one is very pessimistic, and that the state is simply, there to hold the ring, to stop people misbehaving, to stop all that kind of carry on. The second orthodoxy, the Durkheim, Webb, Hegelian one, well, that has its own problems. It can be a bit over-optimistic. Can we all, sign up to the idea that the state really is just a sort of, an organic fusion, a kind of result of the dialectic that people, create a reality for themselves, and that this, can all coexist together. So there are some problems with the two of them. Now I put them out really basically because I'm just trying to tease out where the state, our state, should be essentially in terms of its responsibility for our society and what it should do, and where we might begin to situate it relative to family support and community development activity. The trouble with both of these views is that they are, they're deficient in some ways. They don't quite persuade us of their validity. And maybe we need to just start from the ground up here and look at what's really happening in modern Ireland. Because we have obviously, there's a lot of material out there. I'm not a political scientist, but obviously there's a lot of very good political scientists in this country. There's a lot of analysis, a lot of material to read up. But in another way, I think we need to just keep our eyes open and be clear ourselves about where things are going, and where we are, what the state is doing, what we can expect of it, and where it should position itself. Government, obviously, we have government. There are agents of coercion. There is some force that standardises the complex patterns of social interaction. So we have some agreement around what should happen and how it should happen, and some acceptance of that. So there is a standardisation here. Now, I'm just taking this quote here because I like it. Basically, I think it was interesting always to go aside maybe my own background, which is in social work and latterly in sort of social studies, broadly speaking. This particular view from this anthropologist is that the utopian, imminent, and continually frustrated goal of the modern state is to reduce the chaotic, disorderly, constantly changing social reality beneath it to give something more closely resembling the administrative grid of its observation. So, governments try and standardise. That's, to a large extent, what they do. They try and create some kind of systemisation of behaviours and what's going on in society. They have a mandate to do that. They're not doing it necessarily against people's wishes. There are a certain amount of desirability in that for everybody. That's a real focus. And I suppose there's just a few things that we can take out of this then. We looked at the two traditions, and one extreme people have a very coercive view. Another view is that it can be very laissez-faire. Perhaps, we just need to acknowledge the standardisation, but not tie it in as a coercive thing, okay? And the most important thing about the state is that it is an agent of standardisation. The state isn't just one thing. It's a complex of agencies. Some of them actually are in, almost like direct opposition to each other. The state can employ coercive force in its efforts to standardise, but it does not have to. And there is still immense room for diversity between states. States can standardise in different ways. And what I'm saying there is that there is room for a left standardisation that focuses on material equality, for example, or a right standardisation that focuses on the more mainstream kind of marketisation principles that some states are very fond of. The social outcomes will be very different, but the state is doing the same thing. It's standardising behaviour, it's standardising institutions, it's standardising. So standardisation is not in itself necessarily inherently a bad thing. Obviously, it depends on where the emphasis falls and on what opportunities arise as a result of the particular perspective that underpins that standardisation. And again, as I say, we could take, now obviously these are extremes. There's a whole area in the middle somewhere where you can have, it's a continuum. You can have a bit more right, a bit more left. It depends where the state is positioned in terms of the standardisation and what it produces and what kind of society flows as a result of that process. So, back to where we start. Well, if we're talking about then standardising community development, it depends on, to some degree, on how that's achieved, which view of the state is really dominant, and maybe we also need to be aware that the state isn't just one entity, that it isn't just one kind of, massive creation, that there are different parts to it, that sometimes these parts can act against each other, that sometimes these parts can be influenced differently. So Deirdre and others have come to the conclusion that the Irish state has been standardising family support and community development through its promotion of the service provision agenda. And they feel very strongly that, and I think they have lots of good arguments here, that this has actually produced, if you like, a negative for the community development agencies, for the people that they're trying to work with or for, and that that they would see it as a kind of failure of, I suppose, of nerve to some degree. Some of these critics, they wouldn't see it more as such a kind of system failure. They would see it sometimes as a failure of people to do the right thing, to be more activist-led. They would see it as a kind of sometimes, and I'm not paraphrasing Deirdre's, but some of the people who write in this vein would see it as a kind of sell-out option that people have, if you like, co-opted or being co-opted, into this standardised service culture, and that they are now being steered through a mixture of managerialism, funding dependent on doing the right thing for the government, and basically satisfying the bean counters as well. So again, this is where standardisation has worked maybe negatively in terms of one system in society. And there's a lot of what happens then is that we have a secondary or shadow statutory system for the delivery. So what we have then is we have a parallel system to other welfare systems that exist in the state. We have a secondary welfare system, it's delivering services that maybe are useful for individuals, but also useful for collectives too. And this whole system that we have been used to, which has been changed in the last couple of years, but which grew up quite organically from the early 90s. It began to become more institutionalized. That system, basically, even though it looks like the state has allowed power to ebb away from itself. It hasn't really, in the sense that there's a lot of literature out there in terms of the whole area of maintaining social order, particularly around criminality and offending. Gordon has written quite a lot of stuff about how the state is kind of responsibilizing people, creating systems where people are responsible for creating social order or for maintaining social order in a particular way. This kind of system that we have seen evolve in community development and transport has elements of that kind of those processes in it. And as Gordon has expressed, the state remains a crucial power container and steerer of the governmental functions dispersed to responsibilized actors and agencies. I saw this very clearly myself when I was working with the South and Midwest Community Development Support Agency, which was based here in Limerick and had a strong base here for about 15 years. I was involved with them. I was on the management committee of that organisation, and over maybe about 5 or 6 years, it became clear that the civil servants in the various departments that were responsible for community development and family support were steering the way that the services were going, and had very little real knowledge of community development and family support. Were really just civil servants who had an agenda and had a particular mandate as a result of the political views of the government, and so I would agree that this is a kind of a reality that crept into community development. Now, again, where this becomes a little bit problematic, we've looked at the state, we've looked at the problem, with community development and family support. We've looked at the state's position in that, and one of the things that is important to recognise here is that troubled communities have, to some degree, some of the troubled communities that hit the headlines regularly, unfortunately, have been very dependent on the efforts of this shadow system which crept in to provide them with kind of interventions which protect and enhance their well-being. They've had difficulties engaging with the state's main welfare system, but they have been steered, and some of the family support and community development work has also been steered towards shoring up really seriously difficult situations. And what is very apparent when you begin to look at it from the perspective that I'm outlining is that these communities require both the kind of bottom-up support that you might get from community activists, that you might get from people who are expressing a very different view to the dominant view of the government and the state. Bottom-up approaches, if you like, people wanting to change the structures around them as much as change individual situations. But they also needed authoritative action from the state. They because one of the things that we look at in a second is how you need a sort of care and control dimension sometimes when things are not working and where there are serious difficulties for people in that kind of situation. So what happened to a lot of the really troubled communities that we're aware of was they were offered responsible bottom-up services and, in my view, fragmented and poor state services. So they were offloaded, if you like. Now, I'm not saying this was a kind of cold-blooded, thought-out idea that the government sat down with the minister and said, look, let's offload our responsibility to certain sections of society in this country, to civil society, to bodies which we're in control of as well. They're not independent of us. But I think that, in a sense, was where things shifted to. And I think it was quite convenient in many ways for the government for things to go in that direction. So that's the risks that can happen when you have a shadow system that's built up, that's not only controlled by the state, but is also dependent upon a very different view of society to actually interact with people in difficulty. It doesn't have the power, the standardization power, it doesn't have the authority to intervene. So that leaves community development and family support that's been, if you like, hijacked or co-opted. It leaves it in a very fragile position. It leaves it in a kind of, if you like, in terms of the First World War, it leaves it in no man's land where it's in the middle of an ongoing battle that's really happening in society, a real tug of war between the powerful vested interests and the people on the margins. So community development and family support tried to go it alone, operating semi-independently of other social services and at the same time being co-opted by the government. So they've basically inhabited a kind of space that's really not a good space to be in, and they've experienced the worst of both worlds. They've ended up in double jeopardy, which is not a good place to be. And I'm quoting it from this man's research here, which I found very interesting, because what we're looking at here is a kind of a duopoly, a situation where you have two forces where basically they're very fixed, they're quite rigid, and where there's no give in the system. It's kind of polarized. And in the research, that I'm referring to, that Mark was involved in and others, it was a very strong view expressed by almost all the participants in this research that a collective state approach is the only solution to improving it. Now, that's a very selective quote because obviously there's a mountain of other stuff in the report. But it kind of, it stood out to me that really you're looking at areas, and this report was on parts of Limerick City. You're looking at situations there where the community development family support system has been left in a very, very precarious position, where that's the only way that people can get any support or assistance in very, very difficult situations. And those systems are not strong enough to address community safety, because they don't have what we talked about earlier, the standardized approach that the state should have as a hallmark of any real state, where it standardizes the experiences of people in different parts of the country. In other words, that if you're living in the areas that were researched here, in the city, if you're in South Hill or wherever, you shouldn't have a very different experience of the state than if you're living in Foxrock in Dublin or in Douglas in Cork or wherever. The state should be able to offer you some kind of standardized support welfare system at the very least, even if the rest of the state system is unbalanced in favour of certain more powerful groups. At the very least, the welfare system should be more level. And the point I'm really just throwing out to you today to think about is that a collective state approach is the only solution to addressing community welfare. That you can't expect volunteers, however motivated they are and however strong they are, to really engage with an area, some of the areas that Limerick, Cork, which I'd be very familiar with. I worked in some very disadvantaged areas in Cork. Parts of Dublin, parts of Galway. You can't expect those areas to really grow and flourish based on the support of people who are not in a position to enforce standards, not in a position to make standards real in a caring or in a way that's considerate and fair, and also where those people are actually being steered by bureaucrats in a particular direction as well, where they're kind of torn in several directions. So that's the critical point that I'm making. And rather than be just depressing and pessimistic about this, I wanted to just maybe put out something that would be a bit more optimistic and a bit more kind of hopeful. So the opportunity, I think, that is present now for community development and family support is with the establishment of the new Child and Family Support Agency. And it represents an opportunity to mainstream family support and community development work as a core well-being activity, which has the authority of the state behind it. And that's the point that I was making earlier. If we don't have that standardising, I'm not talking about coercive, because remember we said standardising can be benign, or it can be quite driven by vested interests. So standardising isn't a bad thing, but we need some standardising of what we're doing as family support workers and community development workers. We need to have some authority behind it, as well as having some real ideals and some ethical purpose. And we need to, recalibrate what we're doing. We need to look at, we go back to the basics. We need to understand what, for example, in terms of working with children and families, what is child well-being? What kind of policies work on child well-being? How can we improve well-being as people who are part of a system, who are not working in isolation, as part of interagency working? And how can this really take off in terms of what conditions will make that working together of people who have similar responsibilities or responsibilities for different parts of well-being? What will make that work really well? So we need a collaborative environment. We need an environment that promotes collaboration, that promotes positive collaboration, where people respect each other's what each other in terms of professionals are bringing to the situation, where we respect what community development workers bring to a situation, we respect what family support workers bring to a situation, we respect what youth workers bring to a situation, we respect what public health nurses bring to a situation, and this new entity that the government is establishing represents an opportunity to colonise what we would see as a collaborative environment. And the task force report, basically, which came out last summer, recommends the adoption of a system-wide approach where collaborative efforts are steered by both top-down and bottom-up strategies. So within that report, which is a guiding report now, it's not legislation, it's the report which sets out the kind of parameters, the kind of scoping document, if you like, but it's quite comprehensive, it's quite a big document. It really does talk about not just having one approach whereby the state decides through its institutions how well-being should be promoted and what kind of things should come into its ambit. It also has space for input from activist groups, maybe from organisations which are part of civic society. In order to facilitate this approach, the report recommends an arm's length governance. So it's talking about even within the governance structure, and again, obviously, we have to see how this pans out, but it's talking about setting up this agency not as part of a government department, not institutionalised within a government department where the civil servants will take it over, but as having a separate space, being at arm's length, having a board which will give it some independence from direct government intervention. So, the foundations then for maybe regenerating community development and family support, which I think have ended up in a strange place because of a number of things. And I have referred to some of them. I can't, in the time we have, we couldn't go into all of them. It would take a lot longer to go into all of them. But I highlighted perhaps some of the main things that have happened to maybe push family support, community development into a space that's not very productive. So how do we regenerate those two activities? Well, we need to look at the focus of family support and community development. What is it? What is it trying to do? I would suggest that the focus should be on individual and collective well-being. And at its core, well-being is about people living good and fulfilling lives. So, it's a vast area of well-being, but it's a good starting point for noting what we want to see happen in neighbourhoods, in communities, in towns, villages, in our society. And I would contend again that an agenda to promote well-being requires, because there are parts of our well-being that can be supported through maybe providing a cultural organisation, association that we can get involved in. There are parts of our well-being that can only be supported if we have some kind of counselling opportunities, where maybe we have human difficulties or dilemmas that we need somebody to help to listen to us and to help reflect back for us on what choices we have and maybe what we should do. So there are different parts of our well-being, and they need different things to make that well-being strong, to make it real. So an integrated service model is one of the things that is recommended by the task force on the new agency that the state is setting up. And the task force recommends that the service delivery model should be focused on improving well-being, and this is particularly in relation to children because they have a big focus obviously on children, but I think we could broaden out the focus of maybe some of the work that's going on in this new agency to adults. You can see there these are based on the 5 national outcomes for children. And I'm conscious of the time, so I'll just move on. The service delivery model should be child-centred, where the best interests of children shall be the primary consideration. And children's wishes and feelings should be given due regard. The agency should provide services to and support families. And that's where I think the space is for community development, family support, to be a central or core area within this new agency, is because the agency is going to have a responsibility at this level for families. Now, again, it's not, you can't really work with children unless you work with families. And again, a lot of the emphasis in the document, the scoping document, is on strengthening services at a universal level, which is about really strengthening communities, strengthening the support systems in communities, and it's improving the kind of resilience of families, giving them maybe skills, maybe linking them together, and perhaps really, I suppose, in a sense, working towards creating social capital, which creates trust, which creates positive outcomes for people in terms of creating networks which support them. Supporting families within the community and working to prevent children from entering the child protection system is essential, requiring an emphasis on early intervention, community-based services. So we're talking about community-based early intervention services here. And the Child and Family Support Agency should adopt an integrated service delivery model. One of the key features that they're looking at in terms of how this will be working on the ground, one of the entry points for organisations which have an interest, who are not part of the state system, one of the entry points for them will be the Children's Services Committee, where there'll be room for organisations which have a responsibility to do some work which will have implications for the well-being of children, for families and children. They can be used as the kind of the the space between what's happening outside of the state services and what's happening inside it, and they can provide a mechanism by which those services can interact and work together. What I'm suggesting, just taking out some of the ideas, just to pull them out, is that collaborative working, which is possible within the new agency for community development and family support workers, collaborative working with social workers, public health nurses, youth workers, and a variety of other professionals, that will involve family support, community development workers in a care and control practice situation. Now, a lot of community development workers, if you mention the idea of control to them, they don't react well. They see it as kind of letting down. The aspirations that community development work should always be challenging, should be activist-led. So some people will find this perhaps a disturbing picture that I'm painting. But I would reference this by saying that I worked in Coventry Social Services a long time ago as a social worker, and in Coventry Social Services, which was set up after the CBO report, which is a major report in the UK, which created a single entry point for services for families, everybody in the community. There was a single entry point for state services. We worked as social workers with people who were community development workers, family support workers. We worked with people who had all kinds of responsibilities in terms of well-being, and we had a very good collaborative arrangement, and we also challenged and we also advocated. We were not kind of, sterilised by the organisation that we worked for. So there was room for some of the kind of activist space to grow and to be available to community workers and family support workers within the agency that I was familiar with. And I could see that if people got in early and started using this space and colonising it, that maybe this could happen here too. So again, transformative social change, community development, family support will provide a digital structured space for practice. However, such practice will occupy civil society space and both challenge and collaborate with the statutory wellbeing providers. So again, we need to get into a more organic relationship. The one that I'm suggesting that Hegel's political philosophy and Durkheim's ideas represented more than the ideas of Hobbes and Weber. And basically, just to summarise where we've got to with this, I'm suggesting that community development and family support become part of a shadow welfare system. They've been given major responsibilities in marginalised and socially excluded communities with little power and little resources, very little resources, and virtually no power in terms of the circumstances that they find around them. As a result, the standardised state welfare system has been able to take a hands-off position, leave these communities and neighbourhoods to well-meaning, very highly motivated, very credible people, generally speaking, but people whose hands are tied behind their backs. Community development family support can be mainstreamed and can be regenerated through participation in the state standardised integrated service model. Standardisation is not a bad thing. If we standardise, I worked in Cork City, and there was two areas that the city was divided into. Anybody who knows Cork here will know that you've got the North City, North Lee, and you've got the South City. And the north of Cork City had immense numbers of children in care. The south side had about a third. So there was obviously some kind of practice and issues that were not standardised there because people were getting completely different responses from the state. Now, that's the general proposition. I hope I didn't rush through it in terms of, I hope you were able to follow my thinking on it. Any questions, any comments?